Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's June 23rd, 2021. This weekend we have a major conference coming up and there's a lot going on. And Helga, I think we should start with this very interesting letter that was published in Die Zeit by President Vladimir Putin on the eve or on the anniversary of the 80th year invasion of the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. What did Putin say, and how is this significant given the recent summit?
Well, I think as Putin has done already in the past with his article on the origins and reasons which went into World War II, I think he is reminding people, what the World War was and, what incredible suffering occurred not only for the Russian people, but especially the Russian people, but also former Soviet republics and Ukraine. And so I think he uses that to really shake people up. And he pointed to the fact, that when the Cold War ended, uh, completely needlessly new tensions developed because all the promises which were given to Gorbachev at the time were broken, namely not to extend NATO eastward. Now, naturally, that has happened, and you know, all the efforts by the pro-NATO proponents, to blame Russia for this or for that, it is a fact that it was NATO which expanded eastward. I think altogether 1,000 kilometers, and this is a permanent threat, and this continues. And we saw on April 13th that there was really a shock. I think people realized that when the two warships of the United States were about to enter the Black Sea, and there was a large number of Russian troops amassed on the Ukrainian border, and statements were put out, that I think it was Ryabkov at the time saying that the West is playing with fire by continuing these provocations, and then the two warships did not enter the Black Sea. I think this was an inflection point where people in all countries, or many countries in all layers, realized that you can have war by accident or by just bringing the provocation up to a point where things fly out of control. So I think that that is reflected in the fact that Die Zeit, which is not exactly a pro-Russian newspaper, I think it's firmly in the Atlanticist camp, that they gave their pages to Putin to write this article at the 80th anniversary of the Nazi invasion in the Soviet Union. And I think that you know Putin was, despite all of these things, extremely generous, because he again reiterated, what de Gaulle had said about the Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, and then he said it should even be from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We should have, a Eurasian integration. He also reiterated that, the United Nations and international law as defined by the United Nations is the only body of law which should be permitted, because every other attempt to set up rules, the explicitly said rules, can only lead to chaos and even war. So I think this was a very important statement, and I really must say that the Deutschlandfunk, sort of official German radio station, had nothing better to do than to immediately attack that. So there is clearly a faction fight, and I think all of this comes naturally in the aftermath of the summits. You had the G7 summit where Biden had said that he wants to put uh, an alliance of democracies against the autocratic regimes together. And the tone was pretty much bellicose, even if Germany and France had a moderating role. Then you had the NATO summit, which was a total catastrophe. But then you had the Biden Putin meeting in Geneva, where they said the very important sentence in their resolution that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must never be fought. And this obviously was in reference to this famous statement between President Reagan and President Gorbachev at the time. But this was really not repeated by the United States for a long time. So I think it was important that it's being said. However, unfortunately, then one of the agreements, which was made on the sidelines of this Geneva meeting, was the idea that the respective ambassadors to the US and to Russia would return, because both had been basically called back because of a whole bunch of escalations. But the moment Anatoly Antonov arrived in the United States, new sanctions against Russia were imposed by Sullivan, announced by Sullivan, and this was really a big shock. So, Antonov said that they expected very different signals after this summit. So that shows you, that on the one side, there is motion, to go against Russia, China, but then people are stepping back because they realize they're playing with fire. Then, the effort to bring the Europeans under complete control of NATO and the United States and the British position also does not function, because, countries realize and people realize that they have a self-interest which is quite different in Europe than that of what the present administration thinks. So I think, it just shows you that we are in a very flux situation. And, while it is good that these steps are being made in the direction of at least talking and cooperation, the big solution still is required. And this is why, our conference this coming weekend, which will deal with all of these questions in the first panel, we will have very important speakers from Russia, from China, fortunately this time also from India, from other countries, from the United States, naturally. So I think there will be an extremely important strategic dialogue where, as always, the Schiller Institute is trying to bring in the kinds of solutions which must be adopted if you want to have durable peace, and that can only be through development. So that is, I think, why these Schiller Institute conferences are extremely important. And as you can see by the high level participation from these major nuclear powers, they regard the Schiller Institute as an extremely important platform, uh, where this kind of dialogue, in touching on all areas of relevant science, economics, culture, that you can have such a holistic approach in thinking about the solutions. So,
One of the things in the Geneva summit was to have a dialogue on strategic stability. They're now talking about possibly beginning that sometime in July. Well, maybe they should pay attention to what we're going to be talking about next weekend as a way to set their sights on the right kind of questions. Now, you mentioned the situation in Europe. Uh, we had the Die Zeit article. What's been the response overall to this strategic situation with the Nord Stream 2 still being held up as an issue, even though some sanctions were waived? There's still, Sullivan said they're still going to try and kill it. What's the reaction in Germany to what happened with the Geneva summit and the broader implications?
well, I think that among even mainstream layers, but especially also the more intellectually alive layers, I think there is clearly signs of a higher participation in trying to shape the outcome of this strategic developments. One, I must say, it's quite important that Achim Laschet, the chancellor candidate of the union parties, gave an interview to Financial Times where he said, that he is for a partnership with China, that the effort to completely, um, you know, isolate China is a wrong idea. And he also spoke in favor of Nord Stream 2. And I think this is really important because this clearly differentiates him from this unspeakable so-called chancellor candidate of the Greens, this NATO spokeswoman, Annalena Baerbock. I mean, she naturally is not a NATO spokeswoman, but her policies sound like as if she were. So I think this is important because, I think for Germany to have a chancellor candidate who clearly speaks for a non-confrontation line against Russia and China is significant, even so one can criticize many of the other CDU positions naturally. But I think that's important. Then there was recently, I think 2 days ago, a very important advertisement which was published in several German papers, also the Russian paper Kommersant, where I think altogether so far 1,300 people signed, and this was initiated by a whole group of parliamentarians and institutions, also talking about the need to have a good relationship with Russia. So I think there is clearly an awareness. So not enough, but I think it's definitely better than the lethargy which we have seen for quite a while.
Now, you also mentioned that Lasha talked about the importance of Germany's relationship with China. And obviously, the US China relationship needs some work, but it wasn't helped by Sullivan issuing a threat, the national security advisor to Biden, that the US will isolate China unless they allow the intelligence community to carry through this investigation into the lab in Wuhan. This really is a provocation, coming especially after he talked about the prospect of a Biden Xi Jinping summit.
Yeah, I mean, to isolate China is quite uh, an absurdity to even mention that because, as you know, on the 1st of July, China has the 100th anniversary of the creation of the CPC with big celebrations for, I think, several days. And before that, they have almost every day a major meeting of ASEAN plus three, of high-ranking officials, Belt and Road, and it's half a dozen of major conferences, and so there can be no talking about isolation. And now 140 countries have official memorandums of understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative, 32 major international organizations, and just now at the UN Human Rights Council meeting, the 47th such meeting, more than 90 countries came in support of China against the accusation by the West about the so-called human rights violation in Xinjiang. So not 90 countries supported China. So there can be obviously no talking about isolation of China. And also the spokesperson of the foreign ministry, I think his name is Zhao Lijian or something like that, said that China will absolutely not allow the intelligence services to investigate inside China, that the question of searching for the origin of the COVID virus or the coronavirus is a matter of science and it will be left to the scientists. So, I think that the permanent anti-China campaign is really, not going to work. And the sooner people in the West come to the conclusion, that there is only one way for major countries to work together on this planet. This was said by Anatoly Antonov also, that there is no alternative than to live without quarreling on our planet. And I think that recognition has to sink in, because anything else will lead only to the extinction of civilization. So I would hope that in the next period, more reason develops, and hopefully, this Biden Xi Jinping meeting will take place, could take place even before the G20 meeting in the fall. And we have to work towards getting the major powers, as my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has campaigned for many years. The United States, Russia, China, and India must work together to solve the major problems, such as the world health crisis, such as the world famine, the impending danger of a hyperinflationary blowout of the economic system, which is one panel in our upcoming conference. And these countries must be working together and implement the solutions, which can only be, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, as the Schiller Institute has developed this for many years.
I believe it was Global Times that said if the U.S. keeps up with this anti-China campaign, it's self-isolating itself. Now, there's a very significant statement from Pakistan, from Prime Minister Imran Khan, about not basing U.S. forces in Pakistan after leaving Afghanistan. How does this fit into the overall geometry of this situation in Asia?
I think this is very important, because the point which Imran Khan makes is that Pakistan will not allow these U.S. bases. First of all, because Pakistan made the mistake in the past to side with certain factions inside Afghanistan. And he says you cannot control Afghanistan from the outside. I mean, this has been the lesson. Nobody ever won the war in Afghanistan. Not, previous attempts, not the Soviets, not the United States. And he said, if the United States, which is the strongest military power on the planet, could not win the war in Afghanistan during 20 years, the idea that you could do it from some bases in Pakistan is obviously not going to work. So I think this is really important, because this whole mission, as all the other endless wars which were based on lies, which completely discredited the United States in the eyes of many countries, because war crimes were committed, millions of people died, countries are destroyed, famine exists now in many of the war-torn places. I mean, one has to learn the lesson and stop these wars. The United States, European nations should join with Russia, China, India to rebuild this region. And the solution for Afghanistan can only be in the context of exactly that, to extend the Silk Road into the entire southwest region, and bring development to this region. As, by the way, the Catholic Cardinal of Syria, Cardinal Zenari, had called for a couple of months ago, saying the only way to get peace is peace through development. Nothing has been done since. The sanctions are still there, and the Schiller Institute will continue to campaign to have these evil sanctions lifted, because we have a pandemic, we have famine, we have an incredible situation, and we must get a rethinking in the approach. And, the failure of the Afghanistan war should be one good reason to start rethinking all of these questions.
Well, in that context, I think it's quite significant to look at what was just decided at the G7 meeting with this Build Back Better world approach, where they say we're going to counter the Belt and Road Initiative with an infrastructure plan. Look what's happening in the Western countries right now. You have power blackouts in Milan, which is a modern industrial city in northern Italy, bridges collapsing in Germany. It's really, and also an inability in the United States to come up with a competent infrastructure bill in the Congress. So doesn't this highlight the absurdity of this Build Back Better world approach?
Yes, if all this money which was spent on these endless wars in Southwest Asia, or this incredible military budget of the United States of more than 738 billion, or some figure like that, now the idea of NATO to try to increase everybody's budget. I mean, all this money is urgently needed for infrastructure, for the health system, for education. We have so many pressing issues that must get a mobilization of the population to say, we want that these monies be devoted to the common good and not to endless wars, which only, benefit the military-industrial complex and the speculators and the Wall Street and the City of London, but not the common good. Now, what you mentioned about Milan, they had for 5 days in a row, every day blackouts up to 10 hours. All the shops, uh, cafes, families, they had no electricity. I mean, this is one of the most industrialized areas of Europe for sure. um, and they couldn't get these blackouts resolved. Now in Germany, after we had the problem with the um, Schiersteiner Brücke, the Schiersteiner Bridge between Mainz and Wiesbaden, which barely after a zillion years is finally in the end phase of being repaired, another Wiesbaden bridge collapsed. The I think it's called Salzbach Tal Bridge. Yeah, and it is basically the bridge which is between Wiesbaden, Mainz, Frankfurt. As a result, now an incredible hardship is being put on the population, which has to go many, many kilometers, bypasses, and the main station in Wiesbaden is blocked. So the capital of the state of Hessen, the railway lines are not accessible, and they say this repair may take several years. Now that is not these two incidents, Milan and this Wiesbaden thing, is not unrelated to the black zero of Mr. Schäuble and the EU Commission. The fact that the debt brake is now in all constitutions. I mean, if you don't invest in infrastructure, it is clear that after certain years, infrastructure, you know, its lifespan is over because it gets morose and, it collapses. So the black zero, which was heralded as the big virtue, is actually a big crime against the common good. And, there are thousands of bridges in all of Europe which are in a similar condition. In Germany, there is talk about a bridge in Ludwigshafen, which is in an even worse condition. Other bridges, uh, and there is a backlog of probably into the trillions of not having invested in infrastructure. Now, all of that comes home to roost. The chickens come home to roost because you can't postpone these things eternally, as you have seen in the case of New York and other places in the United States. And I think we really have to have a mobilization, to go with LaRouche's 4 laws: Glass-Steagall, banking separation, stop the casino economy, start to invest in the reconstruction of our countries, and then we can find solutions. So this is also one of the subjects our conference this coming weekend is all about.
Well, with everything we've discussed so far today, the conference will be taking up all of these questions with panels of experts, panels of activists, diplomats, political scientists, others. So, Helga, why don't you give people a sense of what you intended these conferences to represent as a way of presenting an alternative to this collapse of the neoliberal system?
Well, these conferences are not individual events, but we are very consciously uh, having a series of conferences. Actually, if you look at the list of speakers since, I would say, April 2020, where we had about altogether a dozen such conferences with an unbelievable spectrum of speakers from all over the world. We are putting together an anti-Malthusian alliance of people and forces who are uniting to establish a new paradigm on this planet. So if you think that the world needs improvement and that these ideas which we talked about are resonating with you as being urgent, then join this movement, because I mean, history is clearly at a branching point where on the one side it's clear the old paradigm doesn't function. You know, who had a pandemic? Well, it was not everybody. We had a pandemic because the West liberalized our health system. If we would have an approach like the Chinese had in Wuhan, it would never have become a pandemic. And now the urgency to build modern health systems in every single country is more obvious than ever, because it will not stop and new pandemics will not stop until we overcome the underdevelopment of the developing countries. And unfortunately, that has also sort of become part of the United States and Europe, where parts are not really industrialized and well doing. So then naturally, we also fight for a cultural renaissance. People need hope. People need to have a vision. There was just a study by the Brown University which found that 4 times as many soldiers committed suicide than lost their life in combat. Now, that should tell us also something about when people lose hope and they think, their life is not spent in a meaningful way. And this is why the fourth panel of this coming conference will also have a lot of discussion about philosophy, about beautiful classical culture, poetry, and some surprises. So you should definitely participate in this conference. If you want to have translation, you should definitely register, because we will have live translation into several languages. But the most important is that you become an active part of the solution to the problems of this world.
You can register for this at the schillerinstitute.com. It's this Saturday, the 26th of June, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and then again on Sunday, the 27th. Become part of this movement, and you'll see that what we're talking about is not academic, it's not speculation, it's not scenarios. It's actually building a movement that will change the world. So Helga, I think we've covered a lot. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week or the weekend.
This weekend, absolutely.